Hey class, I wanted to show you a few techniques for how you could possibly use some of the analog textures that I showed you how you could create in the previous videos earlier this week. So if you have tried your hand at some chalk and watercolor and are wondering how you could integrate those into drawings, I want to show you how I might do that here. So in this Photoshop file, I have just dragged in my PDF from Illustrator. So I exported it as a PDF file from Illustrator first and then brought it into Photoshop. I'm first going to create a layer at the bottom here just by clicking on this add layer sign. And I'm going to select white in my palette and then just go to these three little dots and grab the paint bucket tool. If you don't see it, just hold down on the three dots and this side menu will come up and you can just select it here. So I'm going to fill that layer with white and then just drag it underneath my other layer. I want us to make sure that we're always using good file structures in our files. So I'm going to rename this to background and I'm going to name this to LI section. I use a kind of a file system in my Photoshop files where I preface all of my layers with these little distinctions. So LI stands for line work. I also use F for fill or IMG for images. And I find that really helpful to keep all of my sections organized. One more thing to check is that when we're working in Photoshop, if you have just downloaded Photoshop for the first time, your preferences might be automatically set to have auto select checked on. I always work with auto select turned off. I just find it easier to use that way. If you do have auto select on, you might notice that you aren't selecting the things that you think you're selecting. So if you have it turned on, Photoshop will basically select the layer that you grab, that you have your pointer on. So if this is on layer, so let's say I wanted to select the background and move it around or do something different with it. I wouldn't be able to do that because Photoshop would just grab whatever layer is on the top of the stack. It doesn't matter what other thing I have selected. So my recommendation is to just turn that off. Okay, so I'm just going to look over here. I have this scan from one of the exercises that I did earlier this week. And I think that this lower texture would be really interesting to use as a ground plane. So I'm going to use the rectangular marquee here and draw a selection window around some of the content. Then I'm just going to use Control C to copy. I'll go back into my site section and go Control V to paste. So this has come in, and now I'm going to rename it F watercolor ground. Whenever you have a tool selected, like right now you can see I still have the marquee selection tool. If you want to go back to your regular arrow, you can just press V. V is the shortcut to get back to your selection arrow. So now I can move this around and I'm going to move it to the corner of my ground. I'm going to use the transform command to scale this up. Control T will bring us into the transform command. And I'm just going to drag the corner up so that it fits the entire width of my site and press enter to fix the command. So now we have this texture, but how can we actually use it? I'm going to just pop it behind my section layer. And then I'm going to go onto my section layer here and use the magic wand tool. You can use W as a shortcut to access this. I'm going to click inside my line work where the section is here. So you can see that a selection is made within the lines. As long as your lines are closed and there's no spaces opening them up, Photoshop will select what's inside the line work. Now I can go back to my watercolor ground layer, and I'm just going to click on this layer mask down here. So if I click layer mask, Photoshop will automatically cut away all of the rest of the material that is outside of my selection. So that's really handy. Okay, so I have this ground, but maybe I want to show some different stratas within this. I don't need to use another texture. I could actually duplicate this one and manipulate it so that I'm showing different things. So first thing I'm going to do is just select it and make sure that the image is selected and go Control J to duplicate the layer. Then I'm going to grab my polygonal lasso and I am going to select a portion of the ground. Maybe I'll select another portion down here. And I'm just going to randomly select these areas. If you were studying your site and you had detailed information about the types of strata that's below your site, you would probably want to pay more attention to what you're selecting. So I have some selections, and what I would like is to remove those from this layer mask. So click on the layer mask and just press delete. If yours, yeah, it's not going to look like it did anything, but we're going to manipulate the layer further. So Control D deselects your selection. Now I'm going to use a blend mode to make this show up differently. So if I go to multiply, you can see that the portions of the texture that are left over are now being added in a new way and blended with the layer beneath them. So multiply is one thing you could use. If you just hover over all of these different blend modes, you can see what impact they have on the texture below. So if you want a really subtle effect, you might go for soft light. If you want a deeper effect, you might try overlay. There's a whole bunch of different blend modes. So it's fun to just kind of experiment and see what these do. I'm going to stick with multiply, and I'm just going to take it down to maybe 80%. Okay. Now, if I want to add some color over top of some of these layers, I'm going to press Control and then click on my layer mask, the one that has the part of the layers removed. If you Control click on anything, it will select the objects in that layer. So I Control clicked on my layer mask, and now I'm going to add a new layer down here and call it F ground color. And then I'm going to pick a color from my color picker over here. I'm going to choose like a rusty kind of a brown coppery color. I'll press B for the brush tool, and I'm just going to use the parentheses, the right parentheses, to increase the size of my brush, and right click, and I'm just going to bring the hardness down to 0. That means it's going to have like a really soft feathered edge. So then I'm going to like go in and maybe brush in some color to these strata. Maybe that one will be all brown. And then Control D to deselect. And now I'm going to change the opacity of this just so it's a little bit more subtle. So maybe even 15% or something like that. So with one texture and a few uses of the layers, you can see that we can really easily add like a stratified ground effect to the base of your section. Now, I want to point out that we wouldn't have this material inside the buildings. So if you haven't drawn a ground line that goes underneath your buildings, I would say you probably want to do that. I drew it in Rhino really quickly and I didn't include the baseline, but I should have mentioned that it's important to separate your buildings from the ground because they're not all one material, of course. So I'm just using the polygonal lasso to make a selection around that. And then I can go onto these layers and just delete them from the layer mask. So now those buildings are no longer filled with that texture. And I'll make sure it's deleted from the ground color as well. Okay, so we could do the same thing with the water. So I have a selection made in this other background texture that I created. I'm just going to move it down here and Control C. Go back to my site section, go Control V. So now that water texture is in place, and I'm going to put it over here where the water is. Just remember to name it F water. And now I'll resize it so that it fits within that area. And I can use my magic wand to select the water area, go onto the F water layer, and click the layer mask tool. So now we have a water texture as well. And maybe I'd like that to be more subtle, so I'm just going to bring down the opacity, something like that.